Welcome to Constructive Thinking, a podcast from the Progressive Contractors Association of Canada. Today, our guest is Marco Navarro-Genie, president of Haultain Research Institute. His organization is an independent educational organization dedicated to finding solutions to the structural inequities detrimental to landlocked Canadian provinces. This podcast was recorded on January 13, 2026. Welcome, Marco.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, Paul.
Well, let's begin this conversation by an introduction. Why don't you, for our listeners, provide a bit of a sketch of who you are, the organization you work with and for, and then we can jump into our conversation.
Absolutely. As you pointed out, my name is Marco. I am originally born in Nicaragua, moved to Canada in the late 70s as a result of a civil war back home, which is kind of still going on, sad to say, and landed here in Alberta in the early 90s. So I'm a former academic of some sort, taught in various universities, and then jumped out of the universities into what people loosely call the freedom movement, sort of public policy think tanks of a kind of a market persuasion. And I founded the Haultain Research Institute, which you mentioned in your introduction. And I also work as the research vice president of another think tank based in the Western Prairies, the Frontier Center for Public Policy.
Well, fantastic. And I encourage our viewers to check out those websites. And I also know that you are a regular blogger and offer keen insights on a variety of different perspectives, which are of value. But let's start talking about a few things. One of the things, Marco, that you and I talked about recently was the demographics in the labor market. More generally, the rather fascinating change that we're seeing right at this moment, a change from perhaps a bit of a lackadaisical posture when it came to building Canada to now kind of like a hyperdrive. Let's talk a little bit about what are your perspectives on that, Marco?
Yeah, thank you. I sense, and we all can see it, it's kind of right in front of our noses, that for the last sort of 10, 12 years, it was nearly impossible to build anything of major importance in this country. We were told how many times that there was no business case for this and there was no business case for that. There was simply no appetite at the federal level and in other parts of the country for large infrastructure projects. And so it's been kind of interesting that way. And then suddenly something shifted about this time last year, if you recall. This is about the time when the former Prime Minister got sort of pushed out by his own party and things began to change. In some respects, also because of the presence of a new personality in the United States, President Trump. And so we have now kind of shifted the rhetoric of the federal government to, I believe the Prime Minister Carney said, we're going to build. And so if we think of it in terms of a pendulum, the pendulum seems to be swinging towards the other side, at least rhetorically. And that brings us to basically this year, 2026, to be a kind of a transition period that we've left the never going to build anything large behind, and the build is kind of in the future because we can't just start building from one day to the next.
Well, that's interesting. And, as you know, the Progressive Contractors Association is a community of construction contractors, of builders. And so connected to what you just said, I think there's a fair bit of interest amongst our members in respect to this more deliberate and intentional approach to building Canada, because we're ready and able and willing to roll up our arm sleeves as contractors and do that building. But what are some of the challenges, Marco, that we continue to have? We have an attitudinal shift in Ottawa that seems to be replicated with the provincial premiers for the most part. But in addition to the attitudinal shift, are there still some remaining roadblocks when it comes to the kind of the process of change, the regulation environment? We have the Major Project Office, which seems to be rolling out a red carpet to advance to final investment decision and construction execution of certain projects. But is this enough? Is this the full picture? Are we missing something still?
Yeah, so if we think of this being this transition period, I think what you're asking is, what do we have here in this transition period? What is the nature of this transition period? The rhetoric has changed. The attitudes seem to have changed. That remains to be seen. There is this new office, which to me anyway, as a kind of sort of libertarian economy kind of guy, is a bit of a paradox to create more bureaucracy to speed things up. That's what the Major Projects Office seems to be. And in my mind, that represents a big question mark, whether that's actually going to do what we think it's going to do, which is expedite projects. I think that's a question mark. The other thing that has kind of changed the conversation is the MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding between Alberta and Saskatchewan, where there is, again, promises in the future that there will be major projects, that the federal government is willing to entertain them, that if they come to the Major Projects Office, the Major Projects Office will look at them. There is, in other words, the palm facing the oil patch in Alberta has lowered. And that's all good. But there remain many things that one ought to be careful about. For one, as I just pointed out, you can't just kickstart an entire economic sector like construction from on a dime, basically, right? So there are things that you need in order to be able to be successful about that. You need a lot of careful planning. You need lots of good qualified labor. But typically what drives major projects, especially large energy projects and infrastructure, is not so much the labor, it's the investment. If the money comes and the money is there, the labor comes, as we have seen these waves in Alberta. So the money is the first thing. And there remain, Paul, still many risky things that are not likely going to make investors, domestic and international, rush to Canada. People have memories and people are cautious. Money is cautious typically. And there remain a whole bunch of barriers. For example, there is talk inside even the Major Projects Office about what exactly is the role and the voice of Aboriginal communities in this engagement, so-called, that we are expected to have. Does that mean that we can now, and I know what the answer to the question is, but we have to ask the question, does it really mean that something like Energy East can go ahead and we can bring Western oil out to the eastern shores? Does it mean that BC is now willing to let more pipelines be built across its territory onto Pacific Tidewater? And is the ban, the tanker ban in the upper section of BC going to be lifted? You know, those things are big impediments or potential impediments to this notion that we're going to build. And so they need to be dealt with. They need to be set aside. However, we're going to deal with them. And I think only then are we going to create a climate in which investors are going to be a little bit more comfortable bringing their money to these projects.
Yeah, it's very interesting. You know, without being presumptive, you know, one of the, I think, challenges that I hear you identifying, although I use my own example, which relates to the tanker ban, is the likelihood that Prime Minister Carney would have to offer a one-time exemption or alteration to the tanker ban for a new West Coast pipeline. And I think on the one side, there's a certain practicality to that, a sort of a necessity to that. But when you look more broadly, again, if you think that through the eyes of an investor, whether domestic or international, if these are a series of one-offs, whether regulatory set-asides or major project office naming of one project but not another, does that really actually inspire the confidence that we as Canada are looking for, or are we looking instead at a kind of a piecemeal approach, a kind of a segmented approach, which really doesn't necessarily stand, the deeper scrutiny that one might have?
No, that is absolutely true. If we proceed on the basis of we like this project and not that one, or this one is going to get us votes but not that one, if we don't set up basically a structure that is market attractive, that is non-ideological and non-whimsical in the sense that it is not going to be predicated on the preferences of a politician or a few politicians or a small community or larger communities or a province or another province or what have you. If we do that, we are not creating the necessary conditions to attract the kind of investment that we need. And the other risk, by the way, is the electoral risk. We saw a Quebec MP and former Minister of the Environment, Stephen Guilbeault, walk out of the cabinet in protest over the MOU because in his mind, it is inconsistent with the environmental objectives that the government has. And Prime Minister Carney has not really addressed that, but we all know that they are somewhat in contradiction. And so that particular conflict needs to be worked out because, well, largely the caucus that supports Prime Minister Carney is the same caucus as the caucus of Prime Minister Trudeau. And so the new Prime Minister can say all that he wants in public. The reality is that there remain fractures and fissures inside his caucus that could bring his support down. And that would have an electoral effect. So if Ontario and Quebec suddenly are perceived to be pulling away from their support of this government, I could foresee that this government would pedal back in some of these promises.
Interesting. So, this is perhaps not illusory, but somewhat delicate and fragile in respect of the political alignment that we see coming together. Perhaps is not as deep as one might hope. I want to pivot in a moment to Venezuela, given the fact that it only very recently was this rather monumental situation developing in respect of the U.S. and the removal of Maduro as the leader of Venezuela, and with a fairly clear ambition to strengthen its oil access. Before I go to that, one other component you mentioned, and I think correctly, that when the investors move, so too does the labor force, and I think that we've seen that many times. But I wonder, Marco, if there's a kind of also a danger bell ringing in the background of that. And I'll use the example of the Trans Mountain Pipeline and the Coastal GasLink Pipeline, which happened simultaneously, roughly, and were a major drain on workforce. And it is one of the challenges that we must face together as government and industry in Canada, the degree to which the Carney government might be successful in igniting investment in these projects. If they happen, quote unquote, all at once, does this represent a domino effect into other sectors of the construction economy and beyond, where we once again have what we don't have right now? We don't have a tight labor market. We actually have skilled workers who are being laid off, which is a bit, off pattern to prior years. But do we face once again the prospect of success creating another problem, which is we don't have enough workers in the country? And are our governments and industry working well enough together to build that current and future skilled workforce?
It is a a looming problem, and a problem that is in a kind of a cycle. So it depends on when it hits. So, for example, in 2025, we saw a large surge of jobs going to industrial mega projects that needed maintenance, and so there is, in the Alberta economy, for example, that surge represents a move of labor in the skill sector between 5 and 10,000 jobs that suddenly go to these projects that require temporary attention, maintenance of pipelines and upgraders and that sort of thing. So that doesn't necessarily create jobs. It's just simply moving jobs from a particular projects to another on a temporary basis. And then if we were lucky enough to have 2 or 3 big mega projects starting, not just in Alberta, but across the country, then we also get a surge in demand for that labor. In the context of sort of the energy industry in Alberta specific, there is a kind of hierarchy of urgency in these sort of labor demands. The oil sands maintenance and turnarounds, they need to be done when they need to be done. So companies are willing to pay a premium for people to be attracted to do those jobs, because without those, they cannot continue to operate. And then there is the actual mega projects that are beginning, if they are beginning. So that's another stress on that particular labor pool. Then there is the commercial and the institutional construction that takes place more or less, at a steady pace. Sometimes municipal infrastructure and municipal infrastructure maintenance, and at the very bottom is residential housing. Mm-hmm. And so if you look at that list and you think of it as the presence of these projects as a kind of a vacuum that it starts pulling jobs upwards, that means that the attractiveness to labor for these projects increases dramatically, and that drains the availability of labor force for residential housing. And that creates problems in a country where residential housing is already in lacking seriously, and so all these things coming together all at once are bound to open scabs and sores of the lack of attention that we have given to these things over the last 10 years, and create a good deal of problems, especially on the labor side.
Well, I'd like to talk a bit more about this whole, because there's so many facets to this labor picture in Canada, and I'd like to circle back to that. But as I alluded to a moment ago, let's talk a little bit about the disruptive factor of the Venezuela situation. We talked, at the beginning of this session about the interesting prospects of a successful build program of the Carney administration, and I think there's general sort of interest in that. We see some cracks in that edifice. Is one of the newest cracks then this Venezuela situation, Marco, as the Americans begin to kind of, I wouldn't call it repatriating, but trying to tuck under their arm a very robust regime of oil supply, when here we are as Canada for many decades being a key supplier. I think most of our oil goes south of the border. That's not going to suddenly stop. But what do we see on the landscape in terms of problems that may arise with this new Venezuela situation, Marco?
It's interesting, right? Because Venezuela is far away. I think most Canadians probably wouldn't be able to pick it out and put their finger on a map. But it's far enough, but not far enough at the same time. Yeah. So Venezuela is the largest, exhibits the largest proven oil reserves in the world. So that has an impact on our oil, even in an abstract sense. But in a real effective sense, it has an impact because a lot of our oil, as you point out, the lion's share of our oil goes to the United States. And it's refined on the Gulf Coast refinery infrastructures. Those of us who have, for example, traveled somewhere between, say, Houston and Louisiana, or Houston and New Orleans, or Houston and further out to Oklahoma, we see on the coast these basically steel cities look like. These amazing facilities. What they do is they process a lot of our oil and gas.
Yes.
But they were originally built to process heavy Venezuelan crude years and years ago. And so they have the capability to process heavy bitumen like ours, or heavy oil like Venezuela's. That means that the time and the space to process that oil now has competition if Venezuela manages to rev up its production. Venezuela at its peak used to export over 2 million barrels a day about 10 years ago. They're now down to maybe about 800,000, maybe a little bit less than that. By the looks of it, Paul, they could, in the next maybe 12, 15 weeks, increase their production by about 400,000 barrels. So that's already significant. And that is going to have an effect on our oil, because it is closer to the refineries.
Yeah.
It is also cheaper to transport it to the refineries. And so that clogs the opportunity for our oil to go down. The way we have dealt with this before is to pay a price differential, or rather not pay. What that means is that in order to provide incentives to pipeline operators to send our bitumen down to the coastline, we sell our oil to middlemen in the United States, American enterprises, at a discount. On the average, sometimes $15, $20 a barrel discount. And what they do with the oil is they pipe it all the way down to the coast, and often they don't even process it on the coast, especially if it is already glutted from Venezuelan oil. They're going to put it on tankers and then sell it in the open market somewhere else.
Right.
And they're pocketing the difference, and the difference is in the billions. At the Frontier Center, we have a tool to count the number of dollars that we're losing by the second. If you go to the frontiercenter.org and you scroll down to the bottom of the page, you can see the counter. It is billions and billions of dollars that we forego. At present prices, is big numbers. If we have to even drop our prices even more to make it more competitive with the Venezuelan likely glut in a few months, then we're going to be in trouble. What this tells us, and I'm not the first one to say this, we've heard the leader of the opposition and several other real experts on the issue. What we need is the opportunity to be able to sell more oil every which way but south. We need more pipelines to the east, more pipelines to the west, more pipelines to the north, more pipelines. And the Venezuelan situation also creates an opportunity. Look, about the lion's share of their 800,000 barrels are being sold to China currently, or where. Now that Maduro is out, the Chinese will be cut off. That means if we had the opportunity, if we had the means to pipe out to the West Coast a few 100,000 barrels more, we could fill that gap. But that's not likely going to happen. Yeah. So this opportunity with Venezuela is both good and bad, depending on how we react. But we have to react now, and we have to start essentially laying the ground for more capacity right away. Right.
Well, yeah, and hence the recent letter from Premier Smith to Carney to reduce the approval period down from 2 years. And I think she wants to double down on the provisions of the MOU. You also have Premier Eby in British Columbia talking about something that has been raised previously in Canada, which is, why don't we refine our own oil to a greater degree? And those are all questions perhaps for a subsequent podcast, Marco. But let's, as we begin to wrap up this session, I want to circle back to the labor thing because, as I think my organization is very concerned about issues around competition, competitiveness, and fairness, access to markets, both for contractors and for workers. And one of the challenges that we have, particularly in not just in the abstract, but in the context that we've described this morning, which is related to potentially another tight labor market with the rise of newly approved jobs and an expansion of the infrastructure and capital market. The last thing, Marco, it seems that we want to have are internal barricades or roadblocks for workers to access work on projects. However, we do have those roadblocks. One of them that we can talk about as an example, and our members know other examples from places like Ottawa, City of Toronto, and British Columbia, but one of the examples is in Manitoba. Not necessarily the largest economy, but certainly serves as an example, very contemporaneous, of a premier who just got in. And one of the first things he did, Marco, was to establish a rather regressive labor policy. You want to talk about that for a minute?
Yeah. And what struck me about that one also is that the premier of Manitoba, Bob Canoe, was one of the principal sort of cheerleaders of taking down interprovincial barriers, the Team Canada, in order to face the Trump threat against our country, we need to bring down all these economic barriers and unleash the economic potential that we have. And by all accounts, if we removed most of the interprovincial barriers, the net result would be an increase in economic output of somewhere between 2% and 4%, which is gigantic in terms of current growth, at least double. So there's a contradiction there because almost in the same breath, the same premier turns around and passes legislation that basically says that for all major projects of the Manitoba government, only union outfits are allowed to bid and work for these projects. And as you know, I wrote about this, and I got a few of my friends who are fairly market oriented saying, "Hey, you know what's wrong with favoring the unions?" And what that betrays, as you know, and we've talked about this before, there is in the culture this idea that blue collar workers are only union workers,
right,
or a particular kind of union. And when I pointed out that what that does essentially is restrict labor availability to unions that are sympathetic to the political ideology of the government, first of all, and second, it leaves out a whole bunch of an enormous amount of people who are non-affiliated, who have perfectly good skills and perfectly good disposition to work, but cannot because they're being shut out by their own government in their own province. And so that's a bit outrageous if you really think about it, if you sort of retool the light, because it's restricting markets, but it's also doing the opposite of what he said he was in favor of, which is bringing down barriers to unlock and unleash economic potential.
Well said, and we find that very frustrating as well because we've seen other premiers, particularly in the wake of the Trump protectionism, make lofty comments about how we need to open up opportunities and increase competition, but then at the same time hold, in the other hand, a very restrictionist labor policy approach, whether it's Wab Kinew in Manitoba, Premier Eby in British Columbia with the Community Benefit Agreement, and some continued examples in Ontario. And so it's an opportunity for me to remind our listeners that my organization, and it sounds as though, at least intellectually and from a policy point of view, your organization care about these matters deeply. They're not just abstract, they're not just theoretical, but they actually very much inhibit the movement of workers in the marketplace, and I think at the end of the day potentially inhibit investment. And so the degree to which we are able to push our political leaders to modify these rules to allow them to be more open, more fair, more transparent, I think is a worthy goal. Listen, Marco, go ahead.
And to walk the talk, right?
Yeah.
If we're going to point fingers at Donald Trump for being a bad guy, for being protectionist, which it is, then we have to then apply the same lens to ourselves when we are doing the same.
That's a perfect note for us to wrap things up, Marco. I'm sure that we could go on for longer, and perhaps this begs another discussion at a later date. But for the time being, I want to thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. Appreciate very much your insights, your perspectives. And listeners, please do check out Marco's organizations. I think they would be very interesting to learn about. And Marco, with that, I'll bid you adieu and wish you a good day.
Thank you, Paul. It's a pleasure being here. Thanks for having me.
Take care now. See ya.
The opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent or the program host.